Who would like to ask a question to one of the panel members? Mr. You briefly say your name and your background.
My name is Van den Ban. I've been teaching extension education here. I think it is important to look, if we evaluate farming systems, what are the goals? And the goal can be to improve nutrition, have enough food for everybody. Then yields are important. And there's a lot of pressure in Wageningen per university to do research in that direction. You can also say most of the poor people in the world are farmers and farm laborers and small farms in developing countries. And we have to increase their income, to decrease their poverty. And then one of the main factors is increasing labor productivity and enabling a number of them to find a job outside agriculture. And I'm happy that you give attention to this kind of labor productivity, the labor. And I think we would stress that that is important. One of the difficulties is what Willem Stoop mentioned, that this kind of research cannot be done in a research situation, should have been done in an actual farm situation, together with the farmers who are managing these farms.
Anyone from the panel to respond to this issue, or are we all in agreement with this?
Thank you.
Okay. Anyone else wants to ask a question? Herman?
Yeah, my name is Herman van Keulen. I was working in the Department of Plant Production Systems in Wageningen University. What strikes me is the fact that, on the one hand, there is emphasis on the fact that, for instance, when you grow rice under aerobic conditions, you save partial energy because you don't have to transport nitrogen from the atmosphere through the plant to the root system. On the other hand, Norman stressing the importance of root systems and the fact that SRI root systems are much bigger than conventional root systems, but also that requires a lot of energy. So the question is, if you look at the overall energy balance, how that works out. And I think I haven't seen a real good analysis of the energy flows.
That's a good question, Herman, as usual. No, certainly there have not been those kinds of studies done. Partly it's because I think we just haven't paid much attention to roots. Twice, with others hearing, the chairman of our Crop and Soil Science Department, a good friend of mine, said to Norman, roots are a waste. You know, why? Because they lower the harvest index. But I said, John, you're thinking about this and plants as closed systems. If plants are closed systems, then the more on the roots, the less in the grain. But what we see when you have this profuse root growth, plants are open systems. They're taking in more energy, more nutrients, so their ability then to do the lifting and transporting, I think, is greater. Now, you may say there's more energy, but as a percent of the total, it may not be more, but that's an empirical question. What we find is, I mean, I was sorry I didn't have the time and so forth to give you pictures, some of the kinds of root, you've seen the pictures. It's incredible root systems, and we know the plant which results from that is also profuse, healthy. So something's going on which is on balance, you know, beneficial, but can we pin it down? I mean, I think there are phytohormones involved and other things which are going to be enabling the plant to function better. One thing we do know is that it's a positive feedback loop between canopy and roots. You know, more and better roots gives you more and better canopy, more and better canopy, more and better roots. So I think part of the synergy is that the practice give you more root growth and let the canopy spread more, give you then a mutual reinforcement between the above and below ground parts. But again, that's to be studied. If you can do it here, I'll be pleased to work with anyone. If we can get Cornell people more involved, I'll be glad. People anywhere in the world, we want to get involved.
Why would one think that creating an extensive root system is a loss of energy for the plant?
Well, the evidence that we have when looking at the green revolution technology is the fact that if you grow a wheat plant developed in 1912 alongside a wheat plant developed in 1970, and both at high levels of nutrient availability, let's say under optimal conditions, then the total dry matter production of both crops is virtually equal. Only the post-green revolution crop has a much higher harvest index, 0.45 or something, as compared to 0.33. So that means that the total energy capture and the energy transformation from primary photosynthetic products into structural plant material is not basically changed over the 50 years of improvement. So my perception is still that if you grow a crop under optimum conditions, then the total radiation capture is the same, and then only you can improve yields by giving in on other crops like straw and roots.
Anyone want to comment on this remark? I would like to hear, not specifically on this point, but comments from Tom on the roots systems. Perhaps he can say a few words, not so much on the development of roots as such, but on the role of other root biota factors, which was mentioned by Norman as another component of the importance of looking underneath the ground level rather than to the upper plant level.
Well, I guess if there would have been a meeting with people visiting our department, I would have had an equally enthusiastic and convincing talk about the importance of root and soil organisms in plant performance. And so I love to hear these things, as it justifies the kind of things that I'm doing. We must be careful, though, that words like soil biota do not become like a mantra, that they are used instead of an explanation. So we should wonder, what soil organisms, what are they doing? Are those effects beneficial or not? Definitely a plant that produces more carbon may also produce more carbon to some of its pests. And that is a matter of management, whether or not plants would suffer from it. But we should, and I would plead for the kind of research that's needed to investigate those interactions. But I think there will come a time when soil biologists are being accused or wanting to explain too much by just always saying it's soil biology. So that makes me a bit skeptical when I hear those explanations, but some of the questions are eminently empirical, and if Wageningen does not take up the job, then Wageningen fails a bit. There is a lot in the underground that we should definitely include. And the interesting thing with rice, I think, is that there is now this whole debate that rice is not an aquatic plant, that it's a terrestrial plant made aquatic. But that raises the question, why did people make a terrestrial plant aquatic in the first place? What lessons can we learn from all those breeding efforts to make rice a semi-aquatic plant? What did people want to achieve? Was it only root suppression? Was it a higher yield at the same radiation capture, whatever else? And I guess that by asking that question, why people went in that direction, we may learn a lot of how to go back along that road.
Yeah, I think that on the whole, that weeds have been one of the major reasons why. Yeah, because weeding is a tedious and time-consuming work. So when through flooding you could avoid weeding, then I think that would be sufficient in 5,000 years ago in China to go for flooded rice instead of upland rice.
we've been asked that question many, many times, and I agree with Herman that probably the most proximate explanation for why farmers 1, 2, 3,000 years ago did that. There's possibly, prior to that, the fact is that you could grow rice in flooded areas because rice does adapt better to hypoxic conditions than wheat does, for instance. And so I think what happened, again, I'm only constructing, is that since farmers did have some of those marshy soils to work with, they could grow rice there, and they could grow their maize and their barley and rye elsewhere. And so it got then sort of going from a pragmatic solution to kind of an idealization. And if you also then save your weeding labor, so much the better. And then, the scientists coming along, rice is adapted, and it is. It's the only cereal crop that really can do well, but it doesn't do its best. So we say it'll survive but not thrive under those hypoxic conditions. I would just respond to Tom's comment. There's not been enough done on soil biology. We have had studies done at ICRISAT in India, at Tamil Nadu Agricultural University in India, and at IPB, the Indonesian Agricultural University in Bogor. And all three of those studies have pointed in the same direction. The numbers aren't always the same, but they find that although you have an increase in total number of soil organisms with SRI management in the rhizosphere compared to conventional flooded, the percentage increase in diazotrophs, nitrogen-fixing bacteria, Azotobacter, Azospirillum, is more, and also phosphorus-solubilizing bacteria is more than the average. Now, why on earth these beneficial soil bacteria or organisms should increase with SRI management more than the average? I don't know. It's a good subject, but we do have some good evidence from very good scientists find when they look at these populations in the rhizosphere, comparing same variety, same soils, but different management, that there's a different profile of the organisms which would be beneficial, but we haven't traced from them to the, but we get more nitrogen uptake, we know that, and phosphorus too. So I think there is some connection, but then your soil biologist, Tom, should be really interested. They have at least something they can maybe disprove it, but they might actually confirm it. Also on this question of on rice roots generally, there was research done in 1974, published in 1974 by some Indian scientists, one of whom was a Ford Foundation scientist whom I met 10 years later. I didn't know at the time he was working on that, but they published this in the Italian Journal of Rice, which almost no one reads. And they found that when they did, they did pot experiments with continuously flooded soils and well-drained soils. Every 2 weeks they'd dig up the roots, and they made that sound so laborious, I can see why people don't do much root studies. It's really messy and hard. But they found that by mechanical initiation, the roots had degenerated by 78% in the flooded soils compared to the well-drained soils. I remember I was pretty curious when someone gave me that article, and I remember sitting next to Niall Brady, who was a former Cornell professor, but also former Director General of Erie. Some of you may know him. And I said, Niall, this is an article I've just come across, and I explained it to him. And first he was a little bit surprised he'd never heard of this research before, and Niall sort of thought he knew just about all the research. And then he said, but maybe plants don't need so much roots by that time. And I didn't want to argue with him because, he's much my senior. But it's the idea that a plant at the time it's beginning its reproduction might not need its roots was just, to me, quite appalling. I tell farmers it's like cutting off one leg and cutting off the other leg at the knee and expecting the plant with only 1/4 of its roots, its legs capacity to do its best. Is really, and this is a really good person, really bright person, very prominent person. He said, maybe the plants don't need so many roots at that point. So I think there's a lot of funny thinking about roots. And we have to really find a way to put them really front and center of our agronomic and our soil biology. Because rhizosphere, which is really hard to study, I acknowledge that, but it's really crucial. It's that little sort of thin layer of soil. It's the interface between the plant and its soil environment. So I think roots and soil biology, I accept Tom's comment, let's not reify and abstract the soil biota, but that's a shorthand way of talking about the life in the soil. It's not all in the rhizosphere, but much of it is.
Yeah, I had a question, and maybe it's been asked because just my wife, who's in Sweden, called, so I had to go and see whether anything was wrong. Nothing was wrong, thank God. So, my question really is, and it draws also on what Norman said about farmers. I mean, I have a tremendous respect for farmers as researchers. Not all of them are researchers, but quite a few are. And in fact, there have been programs in the Netherlands where every greenhouse was considered a lab, and then you work with those labs. So from that perspective, it's always been for me a totally incomprehensible that you have 5,000 years of rice growing by Chinese, Japanese, Indians, all these people, and that they wouldn't have discovered SRI. So that, for me, is a point of departure. Why wasn't it developed by them? And I think that is, when you look at the research agenda, that could be a very useful research agenda. It seems to me, what are the factors that stop people from using a technology or an approach, or whatever you want to call it, a system, that potentially increases yield so much? What has stopped them? And I think that's really a crucial question. And it seems to me that, well, Tom has mentioned something, so some people have mentioned possibilities, like maybe it takes so much fertility from the soil that you can do it a few years and then it stops. Maybe an irrigated field gives more nitrogen fixing capacity than a non-irrigated field. I'm not a technology, but I mean, I could imagine things like that. So it seems to me that that could be a very crucial issue to really research into, starting from the point of view that farmers are not stupid. In fact, they live by the results, so why wouldn't they have done it before?
Anyone wants to say something about it? Willem, you? Yeah.
Okay, I think we have all kinds of information that indeed farmers in Japan in the earlier days, just after the war, I think also had competitions who could produce most. And when you look at the techniques they applied, they were remarkably similar to the SRI ideas. Yeah. The other thing is our Indian friends. They looked at old literature from the colonial time and found that the general recommendation was to space plants widely. Yeah.
Single plants.
And single plants. Yeah. So it has been there, and I think that probably, yeah, the move. The hype towards modern agriculture, intensification, more plants, more fertilizer, more yield, yeah, is kind of overshadowed this older knowledge. And that perhaps one of the contributions of SRI is that it mobilizes the valuable aspects of that old knowledge into a new kind of system that is particularly, yeah, that is basically relevant for all farmers, I would say. It's particularly relevant for the small ones because they require less inputs, but as Norman tells, it can also be adapted to large-scale mechanized farming.
Professor Yuanlong Ping in China, who's the father of hybrid rice, once told me that many of these practices were practiced 2,000 years ago in China. So he said it shouldn't be a surprise. As Willem said, the national competition for highest rice yields in Japan is roughly during the 50s. Yeah. Most of their practices were SRI practices, and this time Professor Horie, who's a very well-known Japanese rice scientist, published in an agricultural journal. The Tamil Nadu experience, where farmers, a few of them, but they wrote about this in Tamil in some of the farmer magazines, had discovered that single seedlings widely spaced. They weren't well, they did reduce the water too, as I recall. The article was moving, I mean, the rice plant genome hasn't changed that much in the last 5,000 to 6,000 years. We've done some improvement on varietal, but basically it's the same. And so one thing that's interesting, though, is we've had many people use a priori the argument SRI can't be correct because it should have been discovered by now with so many millions and millions and millions of farmers. I've been impressed that people who, at least I think should be curious, have used a priori arguments and reasoning why it can't be true, why it shouldn't be true, rather than say, let's be empirical, let's go out and try it.
Thanks for the question, Niels. I'm glad that you're as excited as I am about exactly this issue. And in fact, I agree almost entirely with everything that Willem and Norman have said. So we have a pleasing level of consensus. But the reason why I during the course of this small piece of research and writing the report, the reason why I started delving more into the writings of Henri de la Lanière and then delving from a French colonial officer working in Vietnam in the late 20s through to the mid-1930s, and published a field manual. And some of the principles that he was... actually, the language he uses is typical kind of scientific language, where it takes away any sense of agency of the actors doing the job. And it just says, this is how the rice is grown or should be grown. And he talks about practices in Japan. So it's not absolutely easy to pin down whether he's talking about how it was done in Vietnam at that time, but one can assume that he was talking about what he observed there. And it includes, I mean, really remarkably, not just things like using wider spacing and intercultivation. He talks about using the Japanese weeder, for example, and this we're talking about 1935. Even talks about aeration, not so much aeration of dry soils, but aeration of the water through churning of the soils to mobilize nutrients, and intercultivation, and even this is really we mentioned in the report. We discussed some of this previous stuff in the report, but some of it comes, it's only stuff I've been reading in the last few weeks. But one of our contacts in Tamil Nadu is convinced that the value of intercultivation comes partly from trimming the lateral roots, because it encourages the roots to go further down. Well, this guy in 1935 in Vietnam thinks that there was a value in trimming the lateral roots through doing this serrage, but not for exactly the same reason. So, of course, there's always an argument about the mechanism and what sort of theory should be applied to explain these observations. The fact is that there are these systems out there, and some of them, thankfully, are documented. So I agree, we should explore them more.
Can I ask a figure of here? This is interesting. I visited some farmers up in northern Carnatic state of India with the Green Foundation, and they developed their own millet SRI, where they plant at 18-inch spacing, square pattern. They're putting two, but still wide 18-inch spacing. They intercultivate with an ox-drawn blade that cuts all the weeds, but also lifts the top couple centimeters of soil. Now they do something which actually abuses the plant instead of treating it gently, which we say for SRI. They have a long log, about 6 feet long, that's pulled by 2 oxen. And between 15 days and 45 days, when the plants are they're tough enough but still supple, you pull this log across the field and bends all the plants over this way. They take another way and bend it this way. And when you do that kind of abuse of the plant, in that way the apical, meristem at the surface sends up more tillers and more roots. So the plant ends up having 25, even 30 tillers from one column, and also very thick, heavy, heads. And so it's kind of an abuse of the calculated, controlled. They say beyond 45 days it'll snap. Less than 15 days it'll really, break it. But it's a combination of the intercultivation, the soil aeration, forcing the plant to tiller more, and they're getting 3, 4, 5 times more yield on the same soils. They need to do a little light irrigation with that. It's not flooded. And this is the farmer version. Now, I bring it up because I asked the farmers about this, and I remember about this tilling of the roots. And one farmer got up said, yes, my father always told me, if you cut one root, you get 10 back. So this was farmer wisdom about the importance of, this trimming, whatever, to promote a good root system. They have beautiful root systems of these plants.
How many people got divorced because of this system is broken?
Well, I think, let me add something on this point before somebody from the floor can again ask a question. Indeed, there's quite a bit of literature that documents that things like SRI have been happening in the past. But I guess, like some people said already before, the question is, of course, why did it disappear again? And I guess we come back to the main question. I think, at least, we come back to the main point that actually was raised by Anne van der Ban at the starting of this meeting, and that relates to labor productivity. And I mean, yeah, in this rice contest in Japan, people got tremendous yields probably, but also because probably they put in tremendous efforts in reaching those yields. And you may wonder, indeed, whether that's economically efficient to put in so much labor. So that's.
No, that's very clear. I know Takeshi Hori personally and worked with him quite a bit. One of the things that those farmers did was because fertilizer was scarce and expensive. So what it is, they mixed fertilizer with mud, and then made small mud balls, and put these mud balls into the anaerobic layer to avoid denitrification. But that was a tremendous amount of work to make all these small balls and then bring them into the soil one by one. And I wanted to add one more point about flooding. In much of the recent work on aerobic rice that has been done at various places, it turns out that nematodes are a major source of yield depression in aerobic rice, which sounds very, very plausible. Yeah, any monoculture gives you problems with soil-borne diseases. So it may well be that also here, the suppression of nematodes is a major reason to keep the soil, at least for a large part of the time, underwater.
We've had some research done in Thailand showing that in that area up around Chiang Mai, nematodes are a problem with SRI. That was the first time that we found lower yields with SRI than we had thesis research done which confirmed that. What we haven't done yet is to say what kind of water management could you have which would control them. So maybe you don't have perfect aerobic soil, but you could, by certain periods of flooding, control them. And that's, again, one of the research questions I think about it. But many places don't have that nematode problem. And when we're getting these large yields in parts of India, for instance, I mean, they must not have nematodes, but we should be ready for them. They might, materialize.
Well, you know that the potato in Ireland also didn't have any problems with nematodes for about 20 years, yeah? And then we got the famine of the 1850s, and ever since...
But that's also why I think we should be thinking about not just rice, but thinking about how do we make farming systems as a whole more robust, more adaptive, and we're certainly always encourage people to rotate crops. The highest yields in Madagascar always come from farmers putting potatoes or beans in between their rice.
Okay, we have a question from the other side of the room. Linnen, please.
Well, I'd like to ask two, if you don't mind. The first is going back to this issue of knowledge that also Niels raised about why is this sort of suddenly been happening. Well, I'd like to ask you really what we've done so far at looking at really at longer historical perspectives in landscapes where there has been rice production for a long time. Because I think knowledge or problems of traditional knowledge is only part of it. I actually think relations of production and access to resources and choices of the farming system are very important. Equally too, for example, a lot of large-scale irrigation systems have only come up in the last 50 years or so we can't really look back earlier. But I think if you were to look back in, for example, in India historically into some tank irrigated landscapes, for example, you might find some very particular, rather repressive relationship of production that may or may not have encouraged people to produce in particular ways. And there's been a change in the space of choice and access to resources since the 60s and 70s. So that was one question to ask about these longitudinal, almost a kind of political economy question, not just a knowledge question. And the second was to switch to a question of going back to roots. which is to ask, what do you mean by degenerated roots? I didn't really understand what you meant, because roots do age. I mean, they change physiologically over time, and they're developed with the plant to do different things over time. And also, I realised that if we go back to looking at the last knowledge I can remember about talking about roots from the 1970s, early 80s, on the one hand, we were looking to see how roots was involved with water use. But we had some very standardized models developed of the growth of root production and how that might be involved in water uptake and irrigation. And I found myself wondering, for people who are now monitoring water use, to what extent are models that we use in our field trials for evapotranspiration and crop production are still actually going back to some old, rather perhaps generalized models of root production. And we actually might need to re-examine these and their use. So has anybody been looking back into our subroutines of knowledge, not just about roots, but about how they are involved in the uptake of water and reduction in evapotranspiration?
If I can say a few things about your first question on the historical question, as I am, well, at least partly an historian, I think, of course, the seminal work on rice history is done by Francesca Bray, and one of the or two of the typical things she finds is that rice is, by many cultures, at least in Asia, seen as a high-value crop. And because it's a high-value crop, you have a keen interest of rulers of whatever sort to promote rice. And that's one of the things she at least for China, has shown, that up till as early as the 14th and 15th century, you see a keen state interest into promoting rice cultivation and intensifying it by all sorts of means as they can. The reverse side of that, of course, is that in areas where farming system and farmer practices are much more diverse, as Norman already says, it's not just rice. Farmers have a wide diversity of crops to rely on, not just for self-sufficiency for their own feeding, but also for markets. So you always see a trade-off between intensification of rice versus extensification of other crops, and vice versa. So in other words, we have to, like today, we have to be very contextual specific before we can just project certain questions and ideas on history. So that's, I think, an important point. And now I will go back to the panel and remind them as well the second question. Who wants to respond to either of them? No one?
Toss them my way. I wish we had longer time series to interpret. I know of one farmer in Madagascar where he's been doing this for 10 years now. And what we've seen, because he puts large amounts of organic matter back in the soil, he keeps going up year by year by year. My big concern has been sustainability. I mean, when these high yields, my Cornell colleagues say you can't possibly, maintain those without putting, fertilizer on. But we've been finding that if you keep restoring the soil's organic matter and pumping that up, remember also the plants themselves are adding to the organic matter of the soil through exudates. So they're enriching their own environment. If at some point we run into some nutrient constraints, I'm quite prepared for inorganic amendments. If we have a phosphorus limitation or boron or sulfur, zinc oxide, SRI is not necessarily organic. It is not doctrinally organic. It is pragmatically organic to the extent the farmers have the access to biomass, they have the labor to be able to do that. But we should be trying to get some long-term trials out, and maybe if Agni could figure out how to peg somewhere that's already been, let's say, 5 or 10 years of use, so you can start piggybacking on that would be really very good. The evolution of social relations, that's a very good question, we don't have any answer. One thing we're pretty satisfied with is that we have not seen any adverse gender effects. That when we've talked to women about this, they all say it's less labor for them now. Remember, one woman said there's no backache as she sort of put her hand behind herself, because there's so few seedlings, small. So generally, I've gotten very positive responses, and Oxfam America has done a study in Cambodia with University of Philippines researchers also on this. It's really interesting, for instance, in northern Philippines, where they really have a couple feet of water on their paddies. An NGO called Women Health, I learned about this in 2003 at one of our seminars. When I came back in 2004, the NGO person said, it works. And I said, what do you mean? He said, it works. Well, we're working on women's health issues. Oh, yes, I remember that. It turns out that when you do rice growing for women in flooded, with the transplanting, the weeding, you're crouching in the water all the time, vaginal infections and urinary tract infections. She said with SRI, no more infections. So they were seeing a women's health issue, which is pretty substantial. And women don't talk to men about this normally. So men didn't know, but the NGO was quite pleased with that. I think we're going to see that on gender, that we're going to have a very positive effect. We don't know is still the larger social questions. One thing we're trying to do already in Cambodia, one of the most advanced countries, is to use the gains in productivity to lead to not so much intensification as diversification. And we have at least 400 farmers who have taken half of their rice land out of rice now and put in a fish pond, and then legumes, vegetables, fruits, chickens often. And so they're going from a farming operation, which was all rice because they were trying to get their staple crop with 2 crops a year, to one where they now have fish ponds. They're doing fish, frogs, eels, raising earthworms, half a dozen kinds of legumes, chickens, and the farmers say they get income every week of the year rather than just from the 2 harvests. And we have a nice manual. If anyone's interested, I can give you the manual in English where the 5 farmers have diagrammed what they've done. We have the investment costs, returns, all the different lines of activity. What we're doing in terms of smallholder agriculture is now not trying to grow more rice. The world doesn't need 2 or 3 times more rice. We need to get our staple food needs met with less of our water, less of our labor, less of our land, so we can diversify production systems for both income and nutrition's sake. So that's something we're starting to think about and try to promote. I think also our Bihar colleagues are trying to do that now. Once you can find a way to raise your staple food yields from 800, 1.2, 1.5, at most 2 tons per hectare to 3, 4, 5, 6, that gives you all kinds of options. And so we want to keep trying to, I may make a mistake, I talk about rice too much, but I have to keep saying, we have to think about this in a farming systems context. I agree entirely. We should think of more in a longitudinal sense, and if we can get people also help us do this, don't ask me, a political scientist, to do all that work for you. We want to get more people with multiple disciplines involved, in evaluating this and making further changes and improvements. SRI is not finished. We say it's a work in progress, and we really invite anybody with an interest. There's probably anyone from any discipline probably could find some interesting place to hook in to this.
Okay, Rafinda, I think, wants to say something, or is from that end.
I have one insight and then 2 questions. We often find farmers actually not draining their fields, having water in their fields. Mostly it is to suppress weeds, that we all know, but the practicality of it is actually managing the timeliness of operations. So if you don't have water in the field, then you have to attend to weeding at that particular point of time, around 10 days. Now, if you delay that operation, then you cannot actually manage the weeds. It's very difficult, very expensive to manage weeds if you delay that operation. It's a very practical sense that people start applying this thing. And then we often find this people who are doing multiple crops, not just paddy, but they have other crops also, like the upland crops. Then the timing of operations. As a farm household, they have to allocate their labor to different types of crops, types of lands, and then timing of operations. I think it's a matter of how they balance their family labor, how they balance the management with the requirements in the field. And around these dynamics, I think they're using water as a strategic instrument. This actually has lots of implications in several ways. Then the two questions, Neil's question of why farmers' knowledge, conventional, why it did not occur to the farmers this way. But on the other side, what is really puzzling me is so many 40, 50 years of rice research. Why there is not even a single experiment on single seedling? And there were so many agronomic, rice is the most researched crop in the world. People who delve into the history of science must look into this aspect. What is missing? Why this simple? There's nothing great about these things. Very commonsensical things. Very standard normal projections of linear projections of spacing, linear projections of age of the seedling will take you to 10 days. But why there is not even a single research on that? That is really puzzling and unable to understand. Don't know.
Researchers work.
Pardon?
What is a reward system for the researchers?
Also, yeah. It raises all the questions of the convention in research, not scientificity. All these questions.
There's no interest. We had instead of this small project on the socio-technical aspects of SRI, we had a much wider one in which you had exactly all these experiments planned. And then the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation said, all this technical stuff, we're not interested in. We're interested in the social aspects, but not in the technical stuff.
But why did not occur in IRRI? Before the Green Revolution took place, there was also the science. This is one question. Second question, often I have this puzzle. When we are, you look at all the irrigation systems. I come from India. And in India, if you look at all the major irrigation systems, including the tank irrigation systems, all the irrigation systems have spoiled the soils. You find highest incident of salinity in the irrigated rice areas. And the productivity of these areas are fast declining. And the lands under the tank irrigation systems are the worst lands now, because they can't grow anything other than rice because the soils are salinized. So, and then you have huge amount of water scarcity, huge amount of power scarcity. When these are the questions largely impinging on the agriculture and the economy, why not the scientists look at SRI as an opportunity? Is it value neutral that we are talking about? When we are talking about sustainability and sustainable agriculture, climate change, what is value neutrality? Why not scientists be proactively engaging with lesser fertilizers? Because petroleum products are the problem. Lesser water. Why is not that curiosity is generated? Instead, we have lots and lots of researchers engaging on the debate on SRI and either to prove or disprove. These are the two questions that are always puzzling me.
Can I just add that when I first sent my paper to Erie in 1998, about 9 months later I got back a response from Ken Fisher, who was director of research. Some of you will know him. And he said, we know this already. We know that the younger seedlings are better than older. We know that more aerobic soil conditions are better. They hadn't done research on single plants per hill, which was interesting, but in a sense, and that was it. So we know it already. Thank you. We have nothing more to learn from this. I said, first of all, you didn't address our key point, which was, is there synergy among them? Because all these were single-factor, ceteris paribus generalizations. And what we didn't have our factorial trials at that point yet, but we had them subsequently, that putting them together gives you still more than just one by. But Erie had done trials on each of 5 of the 6 practices. Oh, of course, organic matter is better if you have enough of it. But they didn't put the QED, quod erat demonstratum, therefore let's do them all together and see what we can get. They just took a pass on that.
Can I interrupt? Yeah. My name is Joris Stielens. I'm a journalist. I'm interested in Willem Stoop. He suggested that there is a political reason for this lack of interest of scientists in this SRI because of vested interests, public-private cooperation. I'm wondering about how other people, if other people could comment on this. I mean, I'm interested in the political context of this debate.
Tom, you want to say something?
Well, I'm not so fond myself of this Machiavellism or Manichaeism in assuming better tensions among some of our colleagues. I guess that there is a reward system in science that certainly gives more rewards to some activities than others, which makes people choose certain trajectories and not others. There is certainly territorial struggle, which makes claims by people who transcend those territories as being much more critically appreciated. But I guess most of these things are just the simple, petty things that all humans do, rather than anything special in the scientific system where there are bad intentions. So I think I would not agree with Willems, what I would thinking as a bit rhetorical question.
I just would add very briefly that there is something in the report which actually gives Norman's and Willems' arguments on this particular point. But I think actually for anyone who is a social scientist who study the sociology of science, I mean, it's actually it's a completely commonplace observation that scientists are human beings too, and that science is a social process. And knowledge creation of all kinds is a social process, so it involves these social dynamics, and well, which is effectively what Tom has just said. So I don't think this should surprise any of us. In fact, just to change the subject to the climate change, the whole hullabaloo that blew up a couple of years ago around the so-called Climate Gate, where these emails were leaked from the University of East Anglia, and everybody was up in arms because they were suggesting that there was some sort of skullduggery going on in the community of scientists researching climate change, that they might have hidden data or massaged the data or been selective about their representation of that data and so on. I mean, when it was finally looked into, there were no real findings of sort of scientific fraud or making up the data or any of those kinds of things, but just the very simple, common, everyday sort of kind of turf wars and turf struggles, which actually don't come as a surprise to the sociology of science, but they do come as a surprise if you take a view of science as it's simply a cool, rational, and agentless. In other words, you know, it's simply such and such was observed and such was measured, without saying who did the measurement and who did the observation. Science is a social process, so you know these things shouldn't come as a surprise, and that's why in my presentation I made the point that, in my view, it's not surprising that when SRI came to wider attention, it provoked some adverse reactions, because it came from a surprising place, a surprising source, I mean a surprising person as well as a surprising location, and it had some features which didn't appear to be new to those people. So they said, well, you know, we know this already, which Norman has just pointed out. And on another level, it did have some features that looked a bit odd. So they said, well, you know, who is this guy, and what are his credentials? So, you know, these things shouldn't really surprise us too much.
Okay, Norman, yeah, some final words. This will be.
Yes. There are lots of factors, as I suggested before, only some of which I think could be called political. There are cognitive problems, how to reconcile your knowledge with new ideas. What's interesting is that when we first started this, I said we did those factorial trials, or I had them done. I didn't do it myself. The students went out and did all that work, and they did the work. But by 2001 already, Professor Yuan Longping, the father of hybrid rice, had done these trials himself and decided it was worth a couple, 1, 2, or 3 tons per hectare. Already his hybrids were the highest in the world, but he could add to that. I thought, that's good. That should satisfy people at Erie and elsewhere. Dr. M. S. Swaminathan, probably the most eminent agronomist in the world today, did his own trials in 2004. fine. He put in his annual report. And I sort of thought we were, okay, we're really making progress. There was kind of a pushback in 2004 with a whole series of articles, one of which got accepted for publication in 5 weeks' time, in which there are very major logical and other kinds of flaws, which Willem and I look at it, we say, if we'd been peer reviewers, we would have certainly asked them to correct or change a number of things just to meet basic elementary, canons, but they got pushed through quickly. And so we had a series of about 4 articles in 2004 that attacked us. And put us, I guess, on the defensive. We try not to be defensive, but these were very strong attacks. They looked good. They're coming from eminent institutions. And 2006, one from Cornell University, my own colleagues, saying this is, not
Using
not
your data.
Yes, using our own data. But again, they disallowed the Madagascar data, saying, oh, that was, distinctive soils. They did not have any criteria for their own, BS management practices. They specifically said, here are the 6 practices, and we disallowed any trials, comparisons that did not closely approximate SRI. So if only 1 or 2 of the 6 were used, we disallowed them. Now you say, 1 out of, okay, but 3 out of 6 is okay, that's 100%? Of course not. So it says in black and white that if you had 3 of the 6 trials, it was considered as, SRI, 100%. Now that is such a simple fallacy, but that got published and widely cited. So we've faced some really dubious use of science. I think it goes beyond simply human frailty, and I accept that. We're all frail. But in this case, we've had some examples of scientific work that are really very dubious, that can't stand the light of day. And so someone else, like journalists, should go look into that. That's not for us to be trying to sort out. But I think there are examples where, why are they denying this? Why not at least just try it or come and learn what they can from our experience? We'd be glad to share it. We've been very open. There's been no intellectual property rights, no sequestering. We've had everything out there. And so we've confronted some kinds of performance that would be very hard, I think, to justify.
Okay, I think with these words we have to end our conversation. I think it has been a very interesting and challenging afternoon for all of us, not least because we've been here for almost 5 hours now. First of all, I would like to thank all the speakers behind the table, so give them a warm applause, I think.